Hello, folks, and welcome back to the Indaba Conversation with Chris. This is Chris live in central Pennsylvania. My special guest today is none other than Frans Cronje, formerly of the Institute for Race Relations, and of late, one of the sane voices that we hear out of South Africa. I've been hoping to get him on for a long time, and what an apropos time to get him on, what with all that's happening in South Africa. Donald Trump sending a message of sorts to the ANC and the ruling parties in South Africa. Frans, hoe gaan dit?
Goed, dank yourself.
I'm very well, thank you. It's another day, middle winter here. That stupid groundhog popped his head up out of in Puxatani, and we got 6 more weeks of winter. So the temperatures are pretty cold right now. I'd say it's about -5 Celsius around here.
Here, I happen to be in Johannesburg. I'm not always here. It seems to have been raining for a solid week, which is unusual. It's green, sort of rainforest-like. So Johannesburg is apparently the largest man-made forest in the world, or close to that. If it rains for a week, it becomes a bit rainforest-like. So,
no doubt. That's a bit odd. It's more like KZN than it is the high felt there. But so, Frans, I'm going to imagine you're paying close attention to the events unfolding between President Trump's executive order and the fallout in South Africa. Any initial thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think South Africa is very fortunate that the most powerful man in the world and the richest man in the world, separately, have taken some time out of their lives to say to the South Africans that you're very important. And the only way we're going to build a sustainable relationship with you is if you are a successful country. And we have some advice for you on how that might be achieved. And I think the South Africans will get into this. What do I mean by all of this? Not quite the usual South African response. What the South Africans might do to respond to that, and what the positive consequences for the country might be. And I'd go as far, just to sort of say something at the beginning, that earlier today I did another one of these recordings. And I ended up saying to the chap that, in many respects, the interest of the ANC in South Africa, if it wishes to remain in control of the country, and the interest of the Trump administration in South Africa, and we'll talk about the geostrategic importance of it, are not that far removed from each other, as a lot of people might think. And I don't think it's far away, but it's not implausible to suggest that if everyone thinks properly through this, that a point may be reached where Mr. Trump stands in the Rose Garden with a couple of the South Africans and announces the deal of the century on Africa, totally transforms South Africa's future. And it would be a great pity if the South Africans were to let this opportunity slip through their fingers.
Well, I think it's a fair opening statement there. I think what's being missed here by politicians in South Africa is exactly what you're saying here. It's an opportunity for a change of course, change tack that Donald Trump has put out there. Instead, they're going, and Ramaphosa has a State of the Nation address in which he threatens the United States. We will not be bullied. And then successive members of parliament, political parties, claiming America is attacking South Africa and we put punitive measures when no such thing has happened. Trump has simply said we've suspended foreign aid, which is our money, not your money. And he opened up this refugee program, which who we let in our country is our business, not your business. Yes, it does put pressure on South Africa, but there are serious steps that Trump could have taken and could still take if he has an issue with South Africa, such as suspending the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, and even applying, travel restrictions and sanctions against ANC and political parties, and even, embargoing goods from South Africa. That would be pretty drastic, and I would hope we never get to that. But my point is that I think Trump has left a window open here, and the ANC is yelling in a closed window. They pulled it back down. Does that sound reasonable assessment?
I think in public, yes. I think in private, there have been one or two more interesting conversations about trying to understand what the Americans are saying to the South Africans. I see it a bit like this. If you're not familiar with South Africa, its economy has over the past decade averaged a rate of growth of around 1%. That means in real terms, on a per capita basis, incomes are falling, becoming poorer. Its unemployment rate is over 30%. The global average is 5%. And the The reason for this is that the rate of fixed investment to GDP is 15%. And economists can work these things out. If it is 15%, the economic growth rate should be about 1%, which is what it is. If the South Africans wish to lift their rate of economic growth to 4% or 5%, which is the level at which over 20 years the unemployment rate of 30% would be reduced to under 10%. To do that, the rate of fixed investment must increase from 15% of GDP to 25% and ideally 30%. And to do that, you need to draw a vast amount of capital into your economy. And you don't have it domestically. There's a bit domestically, but not enough. So Trump speaks to the South Africans, and he says to them, if you translate the executive order into what it means, there are three things that worry us. The first is that you threaten U.S. national security. Not that you trade with the Russians or meet the Iranians or do things with the Chinese. You kind of have to do that. You can't ignore China that it exists. The Indians do that a lot. They're a member of the BRICS grouping. They're quite a prominent member of BRICS, but Americans aren't writing executive orders warning the Indians off the national security threat they pose to America and its allies around the world. So the instruction is back off on stuff that threatens our national security. What that is, difficult to say, but I imagine Mr. Trump is not acting on unverified U.S. intelligence. And the ambassador under Biden, Mr. Brigitte, a while back spoke very strongly on and made the allegation that South Africa was arming Russia in its Ukrainian war. Again, it would be extraordinary if an American ambassador made such a claim at a press conference based on unverified intelligence. Now, that seems to be a perfectly reasonable thing to ask of the South Africans. Back off on that. You see, it's not saying forget your historical ties to the PLO and the Palestinians. You're entitled to that. That's how I read it. But back off on the bad stuff with the Iranians. Second thing Mr. Trump said is if you want to be a successful economy, you probably need property rights that secure the capital that investors commit to your economy. But you're not doing that because South Africa's just passed an expropriation law that would allow the state to seize any fixed or movable property without paying market-related compensation. That includes the investments of Americans in South Africa. And I think the message is that if you do that, you will never attract the capital, you'll never get the fixed investment rate up, you'll never get the growth rate up, you'll never get the unemployment rate down. And in time, a 30% unemployment rate will overwhelm you. The third thing Mr. Trump said is that if you want to be a successful economy, you've got to put merit at the heart of the economic decisions that you make. And you cannot put race, you cannot discriminate on the basis of race and be a success. And I think all three pieces of advice are sound. And if the South Africans were to follow that advice, I think the result would be that South Africa would be a much more successful country with a higher growth economy, perhaps even a higher growth economy. It would quickly erode levels of poverty and unemployment, and it would start to become a middle income society. And if it becomes that, I think the odds of it aligning broadly and public opinion, we can get to that because I chair a South African polling group, would align with Western values. And then South Africa would be a valued ally to the broader Western world. So that's, I think, how you could interpret the message that the Americans have sent to South Africans.
Well, the problem is it's not going in that direction. So 3 quick points. First one, maybe not so quick, and give you a chance to respond to them. I'm not convinced that the 4% is sufficient. South Africa, given the hole that it's got itself in from an infrastructure standpoint and poverty, pervasive poverty, I'm convinced it needs at least a 6.5% annualized GDP growth for a sustained period of time to get out of this hole in a reasonable amount of time. It's a little bit higher than what you said, and maybe it just gets them out quicker, but at 1%, you're going backwards. The population is growing faster than that, so everybody's getting poorer. As far as Ruben Brigady, I'm not sure you're aware, he was my boss at the U.S. mission to the African Union. I was a senior military advisor there and liaison to the African Union, among other things. And I can tell you this much about Ruben Brigady. An incredibly political creature this man is. That's not a dig on him. That's not a criticism. But he knows which way the sun shines and which way his bread is buttered. He would not have given a press conference on a rogue situation unless he was told to do that by Washington, D.C., because the man has higher political ambitions than being an ambassador. And so I tell you, guarantee you, without having access to classified information anymore, the Americans knew more. And also I know that for 5 months, we privately, politely, discreetly, from Hatfield, approached the South African government and asked them to explain to us what happened with the Lady R. That happened, of course, it was all over social media. People live, I've been to Simonstown, stayed in houses right above the base. You can see what's going on. People took videos, people took pictures, and all this was going on. And then they posted online, the South African government just ignored it, hoping it would go away. So for 5 months, we approached them diplomatically, and they just rebuffed us and ignored us. So finally, Brigady was given the green light to give a press conference, which shook things up. So that's Brigady. And the last one here, so the 6.5 sustained growth, Ruben Brigady. And my concern with South Africa, you touched on it, but more specifically is the capital's not there. So it's going to have to be foreign direct investment or grants or loans. As far as foreign direct investment, look, I mean, Frans, you and I don't know each other. We're talking for the first time. But those who know me know I have a great affinity for South Africa and nothing but goodwill towards it. But the reality is if I'm a foreign direct investor, I'd have to think twice about putting my money in there. Look, I mean, I can go to Liberia and become a millionaire very quickly, but I know the rules of the game. I know how to get around. I know the corrupt things, how people do it. And, it's high risk, high reward. South Africa is ostensibly a functioning African economy with a functioning financial system, but there's so many negatives that people have to overcome. The country's currently gray listed because of financial transactions. It's a country that's on junk bond status for borrowing money. Plus, the infrastructure is collapsing. The worst ports in the world, as rated by international agencies. The roads are falling apart. I've driven on them. The rails are ripped apart. I go up to Northwest Province, and all the lines are ripped out. And it's just it's shocking. Not to mention, if you employ people, you've got to train them and retrain them because you have different levels, very, very significant levels of workforce efficiency, Western high levels of efficiency and very low levels throughout the workforce. And then you've got health issues with people being gone frequently because of antiretrovirals and HIV, tuberculosis. And then you've got to provide your own security. And now you've got to, the list goes on and on. It's for foreign direct investment, unless you're doing something like putting a building in with software and writing applications, if you're manufacturing something or doing something that requires logistics and moving around, you've got some real challenges. I don't mean to paint a negative picture, but all of this doesn't work in South Africa's favor. And this is why it's so heartbreaking for me to see the response publicly from the African National Congress on this issue with the U.S.
This is why you need to have rock solid property rights. Because once you land here, there are challenges that you have to overcome. There are services you'd have to provide for yourself, etc. There's some very sophisticated infrastructure, some very highly skilled people. There's a very sophisticated banking and financial services sector. This is also why you need to put merit at the heart of your economic transactions and not race and race ideology. Because if you were to invest in South Africa, let's say you were an American group, you might have to surrender 30% of the value of your investment as what would be called an empowerment transaction, purportedly motivated participation.
Your mic's acting up there.
Sorry.
No microphone. It went dead again.
Am I back again?
You're back now. I don't know if it's fading. It's
no,
it's not. It keeps coming in. I don't know if there's a problem. We might have to switch back to the laptop audio, which wasn't as good. Yeah, it's acting up there. Sorry, folks. We had a little challenge with this microphone. We started, it was an echo, so we plugged in a USB one, but it seemed to be acting up.
Let's try that.
Okay. Give me a count.
987654321.
I think that'll work. There's a slight hum, but I can hear it. Okay, let's go with that.
Let me. Do you know what it is? It might be this. My phone sitting next to the cable. Put my phone far away.
That could do it. The listening devices the government puts in there are probably interfering with us.
also just watch the show. But tell them the same thing. If you want to invest in South Africa, you've got to surrender a portion of the value of that investment to what's called an empowerment transaction, purportedly to address skewed racial economic participation patterns in the South African economy. However, the actual effect of that is you tax capital on arrival. So one, your property rights it's a difficult environment to do business in. Then you're going to tax capital as it arrives. You shouldn't even tax it as it exits the economy. And then on top of that, you're going to say, your property rights are iffy. We might expropriate your investment for less than its market value, but we might also not. And then there's a professor of sociology at wherever could perhaps tell you that all of this will bring peace and justice and prosperity to the world. But in the real world, where people actually invest with real money, the effect is that you go somewhere else. And the fact of that is, because it's not a debate, this, is that South Africa's fixed investment level to GDP is 15%. It is 10 percentage points at least off the emerging market average. And it is that because of these policies. And the Trump note is very interesting because the advice it offers would reverse the negative consequences of the property rights question and the tax on capital on arrival question. And immediately you would make South Africa a much more competitive investment destination as a consequence. And I agree with you that 6% growth, you do it faster. I'm also constrained here by reality and the electricity grid constraints, all sorts of things that make 6% difficult. However, I will tell you that the pattern around the world, also the pattern here, is that you do not need to solve the problem in order to become politically stable. You need to demonstrate that the problem is being solved. And putting a country on a trajectory that sees a steady and stable lift in living standards will significantly improve its internal political stability. And you will be given the time, certainly here. South Africa is one powerful countervailing force in favor of the country, is that opinion is moderate and pragmatic, centrist, center-right, Christian conservative. It is not a radicalized society. We poll the country in immense detail. And I can tell you a few things from that. There's a 70-80% majority of South Africa's people who would, for example, agree that tax rates need to be reduced, that creating an environment for entrepreneurship and employment is a much more important government priority than the rollout of welfare and the distribution of wealth. If you ask a question such as how should South Africa's sports teams be, national sports teams, be selected on merit or race, 80% say merit only, nothing else. Very often, the obsession with some of the wokery in South Africa is an elite obsession of high-end, very wealthy individuals and the small media platforms and the like that they command, and civil society organizations funded by foreign, European and American donors. The woke mind virus we imported from the West. It's not something that's organic to here at all. And therefore, if you want to fix South Africa and get it right from a Western perspective, you actually have a body of public opinion that is very closely allied to what would pass as conservative political opinion in the United States.
100% there, Frans. I mean, look, my experience is anecdotal, but I mean, also research, but I'm not doing polling, but I've met thousands and thousands of South Africans in every province, except Limpopo. I haven't spent much time up there, across the country over the past 30 years. And what I can say is that most South Africans simply want a better life for themselves, for their family. It's a strongly Christian nation, but also a strong Muslim element. But they're people of faith, the same sort of family and values, and Jews, the same sort of thing. This nonsense, this wokeness that you're talking about, is an infection among elites in academia, especially, but also in political circles, and even infects corporate boards. But I think it's less infecting the corporate boards, in my experience, and more like it's something that works for these big conglomerates. People don't talk about this much, but from my perspective, from an economic perspective, South Africa is really run by an oligarchy of different industries. Banking has a handful of major banks that control all the pricing and the loans and everything, and the same thing in the retail industry. You may see Foschini's and Edgar's and this and that, but guess what? They're all owned by a couple holding companies, and the same thing in the fast food market. You got Cape Town Fish Market, and you've got all these different brands, but they're only owned by a few. Like Famous Brands owns a whole bunch of names, and I don't think people realize this. It pervades the South African economy, and that's all these elites. They're doing what favors them, not what favors South Africans. When I go to Zeerust and I go to an informal settlement south of there on a bouncy road that the ANC has ignored for 31 years with no plumbing, no piped water, no sewage, no electricity, no medical center. They used to bring a roving van once a week, but they stopped that even because they stole all the money from the municipality in Zeerust. They don't care about this nonsense, and they don't hate white people, and white people don't hate black people. They get along just fine.
I have said on visits to America, I visit fairly often, over the years of the BLM movement and so on, that I have little doubt that race relations in South Africa are much better in many respects than they have been in the United States. And that I'd even go as far as, I've said this too, that South Africa is in many respects not a multicultural society. Multicultural societies are very difficult to run successfully. And in many respects, South Africa is not a multicultural society. It might be a multiracial society and all sorts of other things. But in terms of the deeper culture being the values that people live their lives according to, there's immense common ground in South Africa on that same, what would be called the Christian center right, the pragmatic, hard-working, God-fearing, law and order kind of. If you were an American politician and you were one of those, and you came to South Africa and made a speech, you'd get roaring applause. And so much so, I'll tell you a remarkable thing. We had some fun at the time of the American election. Chair something called the Social Research Foundation in South Africa, tests all sorts of public opinion. And we thought, let's have the American election in South Africa. So we put it to South Africans, Trump versus Harris. How are you going to vote? And the first striking thing is about 70% of people said to us, this just isn't in our radar. It's not even something we're aware of because we live in terrible poverty. Don't know. So 30% kind of had a view on it, and those were the wealthier 30%. And amongst those, black support for Trump was stronger than white support. Marginally, but it was stronger. And then we did something else, bit of a back of the matchbox calculation. But we took the same profile, because this was the wealthier South Africans, the middle class that we could get answers from, because they were aware of the election. And we profiled who they were. Yeah, things like how well educated might you be, your income, and we compared them to a similar class of Americans. And from that calculation, we could work out that had South Africans on a broader scale been aware of the election, informed about it, we could estimate the result. And Trump would have won the election in South Africa if he'd been a candidate. And to people who really understand the country, they kind of say, yeah, that actually makes sense to me. It's not as wild. And this takes us back to the earlier comments about Mr. Trump's executive order and the South African government's response. It would be a tragedy if the interpretation of that response in America was that South Africans en masse said to Trump, bugger off, we're not interested. Because the bulk of public opinion in South Africa would, would be grateful for the kindness that Trump and Musk have shown in saying we are prepared to do something to help you out. It might be tough at first, but if you follow this advice, you also could be a successful society.
Well, Frans, I think part of the problem here is media and the role that it plays. Even though legacy media is dying in some respects, media still plays a major role in influencing opinion. I can't tell you the number of people, it's in the thousands, not hundreds, who've come to my program since the executive order, because I've been broadcasting almost nonstop. I'm not getting a lot of sleep these days, but the thousands of people have come here and repeating factually incorrect things that are being repeated in the press there. You know, have lawyers going at SABC about the refugee program, telling South Africans, rubbishing that. Look, I'm agnostic. I'm not asking anybody to leave South Africa. It breaks my heart that people feel they need to leave, but I'm not encouraging. I'm also not discouraging. I'm simply telling the truth about what there is and what there isn't out there. But, you know, lawyers on SABC telling people that, well, it'll take 4 or 5 months to get America. They don't know that. And then they call it asylum. It's not asylum. That's a very different legal definition. And you can't get asylum from South Africa. You can only get it inside the United States. And it's really frustrating because the media is not holding the state to account here or there. And it's very frustrating because the role of the fourth estate is supposed to do that. It's supposed to hold the state to account and expose information for the public and not disguise opinion as news. And everything you read in every media source, and even Daily Maverick and Mail and Guardian, which used to be much more balanced, have shifted so far towards opinion and op-ed rather than news in so much of what they do. It's frustrating. I can tell you, Frans, you know, the South African Chamber of Commerce, I had Neil Diamond on yesterday, and we talked about the number of inquiries they had because people didn't know where to go when Trump announced this refugee thing. So they flooded them, and their servers crashed, their phone banks were crashing, and the press talked to them, and they said 17,000. But then they were asked not to tell people what the numbers were. Well, the South African government hasn't approached me and asked me not to tell anybody. I can tell you that I've had 40,000 or more requests and information about this coming, and I'm just one small, independent journalist sitting in central Pennsylvania who happens to know a bit about South Africa. You can imagine that I'm not saying 40,000 people want to leave South Africa. What I'm saying is that then people have those questions, but the media is denying this, and organizations like Agri-SA and the government are rubbishing the fact that South Africans might want to leave. I don't want to see South Africans leave, but people should be honest and tell the truth here, and it's simply not happening, and that really irritates me. I really I get kind of irritated about that.
Look, there's nothing new here, and in this for 30 years, highly skilled South Africans have been leaving the country in great numbers. Initially, as we emerged from our apartheid past, they were predominantly white to a great extent, because that's where the skills base lay in the economy. But of late, if you would be in a conversation of parents who's had the means or the access to see their kids, we're getting to that point now, study in after graduating high school, black and white parents alike say we want to send our children abroad, so they have the opportunities there, and that's pervasive. And vast numbers of highly skilled South Africans, doctors, engineers, professionals. Look at just the influence they've had on the United States. The entrepreneurs have left the country. So it's not as if Mr. Trump has started something here that wasn't previously the case. The Europeans, Qatar, the Australians, New Zealand, Canada, Britain,
China,
drawing in enormous numbers of South Africa's most skilled people, and good for them, because they got some top-class entrepreneurial talent, tax-paying talent into their economies. So this is a pervasive problem, because in the perception of many South Africans, the options their children have are better abroad than they are within the country here. We've tested this sort of thing too in Poland. If you say to people, if you could raise your children in anywhere, where would it be? The great preference is the West, Western liberal democracies. And there is not there's not a pronounced difference in the opinions of black and white South Africans. And I just want to dwell on this for a bit, because there is a danger here in the way that the Trump executive order has been interpreted in the press, that there's a black South Africa and a white South Africa, and these are fundamentally different countries and societies and cultures. And they're very different histories, and on balance, they're very different socioeconomic circumstances today on balance. Of course, within the middle classes, things have largely evened out. But our dire poverty is something Black South Africans are all too exposed to. But in terms of the values and the ideas that sit at the heart of the society, it can sometimes be very difficult if you did not know to know whether the answers you've received have come from a group of Black South Africans or from a group of white South Africans. And in that sense, at odds entirely with its history, the level of division and race-based division in South Africa is surprisingly little, given the history of racial exploitation and the fact that on a broad level, socioeconomic inequalities still echo racial lines in the country today. And that relations can be positive despite that, is simply to show what might happen here if South Africa grows its economy strongly for the next 20 years, creates an environment where any child born can rightfully aspire to a place in the middle classes. The country would become potentially a very strong ally for Western liberal democracies.
Well, you make a point. It's something I've touched on over the years and repeatedly. It's something I observed for the past 30 years. Initially, as you said, a lot of people left the country were white South Africans, and of course they were derided as being racist and unable to conform to a new system. But in reality, people saw the handwriting on the wall in many cases, most of them, and left for better opportunities abroad in Anglophone countries initially. But now they're in China and Vietnam and Japan, all over the world. And there was a trend that started around 2008 that I noticed, and that's colored and black South Africans leaving South Africa and going elsewhere. And so when I was in New Zealand 2011 for the World Cup, the High Commission in Wellington, everybody in Wellington, South Africans, there were a lot of them, they're all coloreds. I don't know why coloreds went to Wellington, but that was the place to be. But when I was in Auckland, they're all white Afrikaners. You know, I mean, I'm embellishing slightly, but the majority of people were that. It's just where they settled. And so you go to Canary Wharf, you'll find a lot of black South Africans working in the financial district there and taking their skills there. This is highly detrimental to South Africa's economy. You can't build a country when your human capital flees because it sees no opportunity, either because of laws and regulations or equity requirements or infrastructure or safety. We haven't even talked about safety, the electricity problems. You know, it's frustrating. And it's not just that. It gets worse, Frans, and I'm sure you're well aware of this. For years and years, at least 3 or 4 decades now, we, the Anglophone countries in the West, have pillaged Africa for your nurses. You go to the UK, you go to Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and the United States. We hire nurses from Nigeria, from Ghana, from South Africa, who are highly qualified, but they're not given fair responsibility or paid even a decent wage in Africa. They go to the West and they make a good living, and it really drains Africa, and it has such a negative effect. And it's unfortunate. In my country, we're guilty of it, but look, we're looking for the best talent, and if we can offer the best, that's why they come here. So all of these things have a negative effect, and this human brain drain is not something South Africa needs. And on top of that, you've got an education system that has dumbed down the standards to the lowest, most ridiculous level. When you go to matric, 30%, 30%, 30%, and then 40% in your first language, and you're considered passing, you're deluding students. You know, they talk about, you know, the 87% matric rate. Well, yeah, but you started with 1,100,000 kids in grade 1, and now you got 600-some thousand who pass this. That's only half. This is ridiculous. They're deluding themselves, and it's not good.
South Africa's economy has, if you look at the data, been deindustrializing, you might say, since the late 1960s even. And today, if you split GDP into where it comes from, the high-tech, high-skilled services and financial services sectors are dominant in the structure of the economy. But the education system is still at best appropriate for a sort of 1950s a Soviet collective. And the most stunning figure on all of it is, given the structure of GDP, that 5 in 100 children that enroll in their school careers will graduate high school with a 50% pass in math. And then you're not going anywhere if you do that. And not because of a lack of resources. Spending on a per capita basis and on a per school pupil basis is comparable to other emerging markets that have very good education outcomes. So South Africa's problem, one thing I've stressed for you is it's actually quite a culturally sort of united society. People get on quite well, and it's all kind of center-right and that. Second thing is that often the problem is not a resource problem. So the problem in education is not that we need to raise vast amounts of USAID funds, more than enough money in the country to run an effective school system, but it is run very badly, chiefly through the state. As a consequence, you stunt the lives and life prospects of a great many South African children.
Well, I agree 100% there. I want to get back to this actually stunting. It's a nutritional thing for not getting insufficient protein before the age of 5. I'll come back in a second. But, it's money is only part of the solution when it comes to education. And we throw more money at education than any country in the world by a wide margin per pupil here in the United States. And our educational outcomes have gone downward for 5 decades with a few bumps up here and there. It's atrocious. It's absolutely pathetic. It drives me nuts. And it's across the board. Mathematics, English, sciences. I remember when I came back, and history, of course, too. When I came back from 9/11, I was based in Africa, in Tunisia. And after that happened, shortly after I came back to work at the National Security Agency, and I was at a restaurant in Frederick. You will know where Frederick, Maryland is. You've driven past it. And I had an Army rain jacket on. It just says Army on the back of it. And, I'd been in the Army for 18 years at that point, and I wasn't accustomed to people thanking me for my service. You know that American phenomenon where they see a soldier, they always thank him for the service. It was new to me. I'd never had that. No one ever thanked me for my service. So I was in a Hardee's or something like that, and people were thanking me for my service, and they insist on paying for my meal. I said, no, it's okay, I'll pay for it. But we're having conversations when I was sitting down, some of the table next to me, and they started talking about how Trump had stolen the election, or not Trump, excuse me, how Bush had stolen the election in 2000. I'm like, stolen the election? What do you mean? Yeah, the Supreme Court gave him the election. I said, no. Yeah, but Al Gore won the election. I said, what do you mean he won the election? He had more votes. I said, that's not how our system works. That's not how it works. We could devise the system to prevent the large states from, trumping, pardon the pun, trumping the smaller states. I mean, if we didn't devise the system with electoral college that we have, we never would have had a union. The small states like Delaware and Maryland and South Carolina would never have joined because it would have been dominated in perpetuity by New York, Virginia, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania, where the bulk of the population was. And what I learned from that, it was kind of an epiphany because it continued other conversations. Americans didn't even know their own system of governance. And these are people who are high school graduates, many of them university graduates. And then, Frans, very quickly, let me just get this in here. When I went to work at the War College, I came back from Ethiopia in 2015. I worked at the War College as director of African Studies. And we have summer interns. They come from Ivy League schools all around the country to come and work internships with professors at the Army War College. And they're actually helpful for research and things like that. And then they get some skills. Well, they would eat lunch. I'd go downstairs because I newly arrived there. And I did this for the next 2 summers. I followed on. But I went downstairs and they'd be talking. I tried to meet them because they're young college students. And they talked. This, of course, was the BLM and all the nonsense that was going on in America. The Summer of Love was coming up not too long after, a few years. But all this stuff was building up. And I'm listening to these people talk. And it's pretty obvious to me that they have a skewed view of the demographics of America. So I asked them, I said, every one of them I'd ask it, so what's the percentage of Black Americans in this country? And the vast majority of these Ivy League students and a few postgraduates, mostly undergraduates, would be like 35, 40%. Some people thought half America is Black. America's population in the previous census was 13% Black, but because of mass immigration, it's dropped to just 11% of the population. And it gets outsized attention, race relations, because of the media. My point is that our education system, we pour money into it, and our outcomes are atrocious, whether it's in science, math, across the board. It's frustrating. Money is only part of the answer. Parental responsibility, 2-parent families. This is also part of it. So, I mean, I don't know if you want to comment on that, but I got on my hobby horse. Education really irritates me too.
Long ago, 15 years ago, I worked for a think tank, yeah. And we were asked to look into family structures. And we did so in great detail. It was fascinating. Because one of perhaps the worst evil of South Africa's apartheid system is that it made it very difficult for Black family structures to hold together. So we've become a democracy in 1994. We've been the apartheid state for 50 years, but we don't have normal family structures. And we found amazing, I'm going to see if I can ever dig that thing up. We found amazing results that the probabilities that a kid would stand before a judge before their 18th birthday, which is not a good result, was very closely linked to whether there was a strong father figure present in the child's life. And teenage pregnancies, drug abuse, all of these things tracked together. And in fact, at the time we released this, and it was widely criticized, it was seen as very conservative, and we weren't that. We just simply showed that a child needs to grow up in a constructive and loving environment. And there was a radio host at the time who hosted a very popular South African show, and this person said that when they raised this issue, which hadn't previously been raised publicly in the country, the switchboard totally overloaded in terms of the numbers of people who called in and said, yeah, in my community, the absence of sound family structures and therefore the ability to transfer values across generations sits at the very heart of a lot of the problems that we confront. So we had that same result here.
No, that's fascinating. And, what's ironic for us is it's kind of weirdly the opposite. Let me explain. If you go back to the 1930s, because of racial discrimination, Jim Crow, laws put in place, ironically, black families were much better, closer knit and stronger two-parent families. It was only the expansion of the welfare state in the 1960s that really started causing this problem where we have fatherless families. 78%, which is even higher than South Africa, 78% of black children in this country, whether they're the offspring of black parents or a black and white parent mixed race, 78% are illegitimate. That's a shocking statistic. But it's not just black folks. It's, Frans, 45% of Hispanic children are now illegitimate. 25% of white children are illegitimate in this country, and 9% of Asians. You go back 30 years, that for Asians it was 1%. For whites it was less than 10%. It's shocking how this keeps changing. And whenever I tell this story from leftists in America, I get, well, look at Denmark. Denmark, they aren't married. Yes, but Danes cohabitate. They may not get married, but they raise the children in a nuclear family, even though it doesn't have a civil designation for it. So, I mean, we think we've hit the nail on the head. One of the biggest problems both societies have.
I think at the time I recall the stat that we found that 1 in 3 South African children grows up without their parents present in their lives at all.
Yeah.
1 in 3 grows up with one parent, and 1 in 3 grows up with the presence of both parents in their lives. And then you can't do the value transfer across generations. And then you have these societies with these broken value chains, and then you get the antisocial behavior. I wanted to ask you something. You've got a map of the world over your left shoulder.
Yes.
I don't know if you're familiar with, we sometimes put out an argument that South Africa has some strategic importance to the United States. Because it is the Southern Sea route, it's the back door into the South Atlantic, the Western Hemisphere, one of 3 anchor points, the others being arguably Djibouti and the sort of Solomon Islands that command access to the Indo-Pacific. Do you go along with that?
Well, yes, I think the Cape of Good Hope is strategic for sea lanes and geopolitical influence. However, I don't attach the value that many people are trying to attach to it now, saying it's geopolitically important to the United States. I didn't hear the whole interview, but Joel Pollack, apparently from Breitbart, went on Biz News recently. I heard part of it. And my viewers are telling me that he was talking about the Cape of Good Hope being of strategic importance to the United States and how Simonstown is important. That all may be true, but at the moment, the only time that the Cape matters of major significance is when the Suez Canal is out. Most of the shipping goes through there. And we've seen it happen. We saw a ship run into the Suez Canal a couple years ago and it shut down. We saw the impact and how valuable it was. But the problem with the Cape of Good Hope is South Africa doesn't have blue water capability. Despite wasting billions of dollars buying 3 cruisers from the Germans and 3 Type 209 diesel submarines, they can't put to sea. They can't patrol. They barely do search and rescue missions they have responsibility for. And so what's the value of that location if you don't have a way to protect it, patrol it? The only reason it would become an issue for us is if a third party tried to interdict it, like the Chinese, but they don't have that kind of projection. Even with their naval base in Djibouti, they don't have the projection capability to major influence there. And there's no piracy issue there. There's a piracy issue off the Straits of Mozambique, and I cautioned the Africa Command about that 3 years before it ever developed because I said it was coming that way, and unfortunately it did. But I don't agree that it's an issue for the U.S. because It's not that difficult for us to send the 6th or 7th Fleet to patrol that down there. We already have Combined Task Force 150 operating off the Red Sea and also off the coast of East Africa and doing counter-piracy and things like that. What Joel Pollack apparently is saying is that, Simonstown Naval Base would be a great strategic value for the U.S. It could be. It isn't right now. I mean, if you hand it over to us, we could turn it into something useful, put things in there. But simply being somewhere geographically, it's not an impediment. It's not like the narrow straits going around, as you mentioned, Djibouti, where you go around there into the Red Sea. That's easy to interdict, and then the Suez Canal you can shut off. But you can go around the southern tip. So to me, it's geopolitically important, but I don't attach the value on it that so many people are trying to make the argument, well, South Africa matters. It's really important. The U.S. needs South Africa. Look, I don't mean to insult South Africa, but largely speaking, we don't need South Africa. The economy is a rounding error. Yes, there are strategic minerals, but we can get them pretty much anywhere else. And when strategic minerals are cut off, ingenuity comes up with other options. When the Chinese cut off the rare earth element shipments to Japan over their dispute over the Sea of Japan and islands there, when the Chinese rammed a Japanese Coast Guard vessel, it didn't shut down, but it had a major impact on Toyota and others who were making electric cars for about 6 months until the engineers developed an alternative, which they sourced from non-Chinese sources, and they went back to production, right back in line. So again, I don't think it's the issue that a lot of people are making. Frans, you may disagree, and I want to hear your view on that.
You see, the argument is very much not that the South Africans would make use of Simonstown, so they don't have the resources to do so. But what if someone else does and has access?
Well, if the Chinese get it, okay, now we're talking about something that could be of interest, if that's your point.
I'm not talking about tomorrow. I'm thinking more as a Chinese strategist might about what happens in the fullness of time. Because South Africa didn't pass its budget today for the first time, so my phone is very busy, but I will get to that after this. The Indo-Pacific, 50% of the plus of global trade that travels by sea, 80% of China's oil travels through that zone. The Chinese diplomatic efforts around the Solomon Islands have given them an option that didn't have before, an option that lies east of Dulles' island chains. Come back to Djibouti. There's not parity there, but there's a Chinese naval operation. There'll be a Russian naval operation, I think at Suakin off the coast of Sudan fairly soon. Diego Garcia, don't know how important you've got the background, how important that was. Oh,
no. Let me interrupt you for a second. Diego Garcia is of critical geopolitical importance, and that's why it's not going anywhere. They're having this dispute about turning the Chiegos back over, but Diego Garcia is going nowhere. Trust me. That ain't going to happen.
Yeah, Keir Starmer tried to give it away.
Yeah, well, Keir Starmer is going to learn the hard way.
The point of it is that across the Indo-Pacific, there are rivals to American influence.
Oh, yeah.
And you can beat them back and you can deal with the Solomon Islands, I understand, from Guam and later Hawaii. And the Mediterranean is an obstacle to China's attempts to enter the Atlantic. So it's all in hand, in the moment. But it would be very much better from a Western perspective if there wasn't a question mark over what might one day be done with Simonstown. The opening naval exchanges of the First and Second World Wars that are definitive to the outcome of the conflict in the South Atlantic. Mrs. Thatcher's battle group sent to liberate the Falklands was in the South. It wasn't just a question of national pride, but strategic importance. The Admiralty tasked with that operation were very frustrated that what was called the Simonstown Agreement, which was a British agreement with South Africa that the British Navy could operate from Simonstown, had lapsed under apartheid pressures, and that to stage the Falklands invasion from Ascension more than Simonstown, which posed grave logistical difficulties. Castro was very worried, as were the Soviets during the hot wars of the Cold War, the African hot wars, that the Soviet supply ships arming those wars might be sunk by the South Africans operating their little submarines off or out of Simon's Town. So my argument simply on it is that that in the fullness of time, and Trump wishes to build this Western Monroe Doctrine hegemonic sphere of influence. So you must cover Greenland because you can come into the Western Hemisphere from the top, and Canada for the same reason, and Panama because you can come in from the left, as it were. The back door into Trump's plan is Simon's Town, because it is a door into the Western Hemisphere. And it's not assured at this time who might one day command access to that door. So I think it should be on the agenda of Western security thinkers and strategists. And if they think in the long term, and I've had this debate with some of them, and sometimes they've been dismissive of it. And the way I've found is quite useful to win it is that if it's not important, why does China invest so very heavily in trying to have this influence? Are you suggesting, no, not you, but my debating partners, are you suggesting the Chinese are wrong? They've made a terrible strategic mistake. They're devoting time and energy and money to a futile project and pursuit. And if they understand the strategic importance of influence in Africa, I did some work for Fox last night on Chinese and American trade in Africa. China's numbers pulling away. America's numbers relatively flat. Africa's 50 votes on global fora. The South Africans have been very expert at the International Court of Justice in their strategy to delegitimize Israel as part of a much broader global effort to have specific objectives, to fracture if you delegitimize and stigmatize Israel, you fracture domestic support to serve in the IDF. And you cause young American college kids to protest against Congress supplying arms to the Israelis. If you achieve both those ends at the same time, you seriously undermine Israel's ability to exist in a hostile environment. 50 votes at the United Nations is Africa. The largest external consumer of Chinese construction expertise is Africa. The Chinese building the data networks that will carry the ideas, that will shape the opinions of the people who elect the governments who will vote on these global fora. New Americans, the new administration has some common sense about not surrendering one's sovereignty to a global institution. But I think it's a base worth covering, the question of Africa and the sea route, particularly given that it's not that expensive to do, because at an exchange rate of 20 to 1, the dollar goes a long way. And the population of people, the people you would encounter here, would be people who are naturally allied on the cultural values that underpin a lot of what has happened in America over the past 12 or so months.
Well, I wouldn't disagree with you, and I think that long-term, I agree with you. The reason that the Chinese put a base in Djibouti is they have long-term ambitions to be able to project power from there and influence things. And, of course, I've lived and worked in Tunisia, Liberia, Botswana, Malawi, Niger, Mauritania, Uganda, and Ethiopia, and I've seen the Chinese presence in all these places. I've also seen the Chinese presence from 30 years ago, which was often ham-fisted, insulting, racist, disrespectful, and rather juvenile. It's matured, as one would expect, as the quality of Chinese produced products, which were garbage 30 years ago, and now they're world class. They're on an upward trajectory in that respect. China is definitely, in my view, a threat to the global order, but they're not alone. There's others. And I would agree with you. I'm sorry?
I want to jump in on China and say something.
Yeah.
You know, we sit here in South Africa mostly, and we look at the rest of the world, and the view on China becomes interesting. Because when the Western world fell into the woke mind virus and started using its aid programs and democracy defense assistance projects to infiltrate those ideas into South Africa, the damage that was being done was immense. China wasn't doing that. My experience of the Chinese, a little I've had, is that they were very critical of the idea of taxing capital on arrival. and very critical of the idea of threatening property rights and promoting people on grounds other than merit. And the Russians, I knew quite well the former Russian ambassador here, Ilya Rogachev, who was I think he was Deputy Permanent Representative, Russia's, to the Security Council in New York, a serious diplomat. The same thing. And for some of us here, we live most of our lives here, very close ties to the West, enormous champions of American democracy. We get the sense things became complicated, because what we were getting from Westerners was toxic and destructive to the project of building a thriving and successful South Africa. And a lot of what we were starting to pick up from China and Russia was positive. And perhaps 30 or 40 years ago, if the South Africans had asked, should we follow the West or the Soviet bloc, the answer would have been straightforward. 3 or 4 years ago, it wasn't. And we wouldn't have been able to say, oh, copy what the West are doing. It's obviously the right thing to do. Because in many respects, it wasn't. And on top of that, there are very few examples, certainly since the end of the Second World War, of countries that were poor and then became free and then became rich. The model in the main was something different. They were poor. They developed autocratic systems of government that forced what might have been unpopular, but sometimes pragmatic. You have to say pragmatic if you look at what China did to lift millions of people, hundreds, out of desperate poverty. And that, I just want to introduce that into, you don't have to go anywhere with it.
Yeah, no, it's fine. It's and you're spot on about that.
China, that Africa should dismiss everything that emanates from China, perhaps some of the cultural values that emanate from Russia, and follow the West is not as clear-cut.
Well, I'm not making that argument. I'm the one that's pointed out that, in fact, South Korea became successful because it was an autocratic society with chaebols, with these oligarchies that really ruled the industrial sector. That model worked for them for a period of time until they could get to a point where they democratized and then had more entrepreneurial things. Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Taiwan all fit in these models with different aspects and how they did it at different stages. But, I point those economies out, freaking, because when I hear about Africa and the South Africans, ANC complaining about apartheid and Jan van Riebeck, I'm like, okay, fine. Yes, historically, we can talk about that. But these other countries were all colonized. They were all desperately poor. And in 3 decades, at some point, all of them turned it around and have got their act together. So, there's a lot more going on here than the ANC likes to admit. So I want to go back to one thing and give you a chance to wrap up, because unfortunately, we're going to have to go short. I need to cut my guest off, but you do have some phone calls you had to take care of there. I've got to be on another program. So I want to go back to the point you made about the importance geostrategically of the Cape of Good Hope and around the southern tip of Africa. Well, I would argue that, and I think you probably agree, as you mentioned here, is that the current administration is not naive. They realize the importance of these global sea lanes and lines of communication. Hence the reason why Trump is talking about the Arctic, what with the sea lanes being open year-round in parts of the Arctic Sea now. And then, of course, look at the threat to put tariffs on Panama if China remained part of the Belt and Road Initiative with Panama. So I'm sure that the Trump administration is looking closely at this. The fact that Joel Pollak, who is being touted as the next ambassador to South Africa, is talking about the importance of Simonstown, that's probably a pretty clear message that your point is spot on with the Trump administration. So I think you're right there. I was going to go ahead.
Your next question.
No, I was going to say, no, not another question, but I'm going to give you a chance here, Frans, to any final thoughts you want to share with us about the whole situation, executive order, where South Africa's going. And I'd like to invite you back. We need to do this again. We'll do it for a little bit longer than this period today, if you're up for that. But the floor is yours.
There's been a lot of opposition to Trump's order here from South Africa's relative elites, the business community, and certainly the media, and even the political opposition. And I don't think that is representative of broader public opinion. I also think that some of those groups that have reacted as quickly as they have allowed their personal opinions and prejudices to overwhelm their strategic sense in as far as they had any. And that South Africa, to be a stable, successful country, needs to vastly up the level of fixed investment and draw in the capital to do so. And there is an opportunity to do so here now. And it would make a very great amount of sense, regardless of your personal feelings towards the man, to prioritize that in the foreign relationship. And I think on the other side of it, it's nice. South Africa is a great place because we never fell for the end of history delusion. We never thought the West had won and the threat was over and the liberal democracy would spread throughout the world. And we have a much closer tie, therefore, to Western rivals and allies. I mean, there are probably very few Western analysts that have a job like mine that would be able to speak open and in friendly terms. So one must hear, what must you do otherwise? And see the upsides of even a Russian nuclear build in South Africa might be a great thing. And the like, and I think that the opportunity, I think Trump has offered South Africa something very important, which is a shortcut to pull itself out of low growth, debt, and poverty into prosperity. And that's not to say that South Africa would then be allied against its BRICS partners and the like. It won't be. It will pursue an Indian-style foreign policy of national interest first and common sense and hard work. The success that's accrued to the, particularly since Modi as a consequence. And that, I suppose Westerners who watch this from abroad, Americans, there'll be a few policy people and so on, having a look, I think that there's enormous potential here to align the interests of South Africa with the interests of the Trump administration to the socio-economic benefit of South Africa and liberating millions of people from poverty, and to the strategic, geostrategic and security advantage of the United States and its influence in Africa.
Well, on that point, Frans, I think we agree 100%. I think there's an opportunity here, and I think there's a very strong message coming from Donald Trump in what he didn't do. At this point, South Africa is not eligible for the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. There's no question about that. Public law states you must respect private property rights and a free market system. And South Africa, by introducing the Expropriation Compensation Bill in 2018, began to abrogate that. And I've been calling for suspension since then because that's what should have happened. And now it's a matter of law. So they're not eligible. Trump did not suspend them. He could, but he did not do that. And no talk of sanctions. So I think there's an opportunity here. And I wish South African politicians would stop using their personal opinions to pollute the environment, step back, take a deep breath, and pay attention to what's going on. Now, I did catch one thing you said there. It's interesting. So you're telling me South Africans didn't buy Francis Fukuyama's argument that this was the end of history.
And so they didn't make the next mistake, which was to say, therefore, we are now all friends and we don't need to use hard power, deterrence policy to get somewhere. We can find common ground and develop mutual understanding. That's fatal. And to foreign relations, to sound foreign relations. Politics is about power, nothing else. And the ability to do damage to your partner or opponent. And the mutual ability to do that is what makes the world a safe and successful and prosperous place. The willingness to bring hard power forward fast is the basis of deterrence. And deterrence is the basis of global stability. And a lot of, not everyone, many in South Africa lost their way and fell entirely for the delusion. The end of history delusion is what you must call it. But there was a class of analysts who can navigate understands the West, very sympathetic to it, has a very deep and serious understanding of Western rivals, and for whom the Cold War never really ended. And for many young Western analysts, I mean, you were at the Defense College, I understand.
Correct, the War College, yeah.
At the War College, many young Western analysts, politicians, political leaders were raised and trained in a world where the end of history had occurred. And therefore they are completely unprepared and skilled to deal with the reality of the world today.
Spot on.
And that's why the response to Trump is such horror. How can he be so rude and so aggressive? It's unseemly. We should find common ground to build peace and mutual understanding. It's a lot of crap.
It is a crap.
The remarkable feature of Trump's emergence is that it is a very firm off-ramp. And I mean, this was true of a lot of Western governments for a considerable period of time. It's a very dramatic off-ramp from the end of history delusion back to deterrence-based hard power politics. And in that will surely make the world a safer place and will be very good for safeguarding Western liberal democratic culture and the immense comfort and wealth and prosperity and happiness that the Western liberal ideal has brought, and no other system has achieved anything like it. Sure you are.
Frans, I think you've just, with lucidity, cogently, clearly stated what the world is missing here. It's something I've tried to point out in the past, and maybe I haven't done it as articulately as you have. Living all over Africa, I run into people all the time who are fearful of police and the military, and understandably so, because oftentimes they prey on populations. But I hear, the lefties around the world and the sociologists, we don't need militaries, we don't need police. You're living in a dream world. Unfortunately, there are always a segment of humanity, of Homo sapiens, will try to take advantage of other people when given the opportunity. Deterrence is necessary, and a means of punishing transgressors is necessary. And when it comes to politics, I'm finding it comical. I'm laughing every time I read the headlines about Trump and his coercive diplomacy. Hey, diplomacy is coercive. That's the whole point. It's a negotiation.
Exactly. It is what it should be.
Exactly.
So
that's right. It's back. And, they're acting as if Trump is a bull in a china shop. Well, guess what? That's what's needed in this juvenile world of analysts that have been namby-pamby, that don't know the real world. Those of us who lived through the Cold War and fought on the front lines of that Cold War and the inter-German border and the conflicts around the globe know what it was all about. So anyway, Frans, thanks a lot. It's a real pleasure. I got to get you back on. I hope you're available maybe in the next couple weeks, because we know stuff's going to break on these topics going on between the U.S. and South Africa. But I think the message from you today was that there's an opportunity here. People need to see it and seize it.
It's actually a positive situation if it's interpreted and defined in the right way.
All right, excellent.
Chris, very much.
My pleasure, Frans. Frans Cronje, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time. Frans, go ahead and drop off, and I'll wrap up here, and I'll get off to my next one. You can take your calls. Ladies and gentlemen, Frans Cronje, who is talking to us about issues in South Africa and geopolitically. Thanks for your time. My apologies for not getting to the chat, but I knew that was going to be the case today. This is a short broadcast. I'm supposed to be on another program right now. I'm going to head over to that. And thank you all. Just a second. Let me take care of something very quick before we all leave, because you're all still here. I want to make sure that I've taken care of this. I hope that you found that interesting. I know that that I've certainly tried to get you some good and interesting guests this week. I think Frans is fantastic. First chance I actually had to get him on, and so I wasn't disappointed. I hope that you were you found it useful and helpful. So hopefully I'll see you guys join me in a few minutes over on Ronaldo's program on Wednesdays with the Colonel, and you'll be redirected there. So thank you very much. Be sure to hit the like button. If you're not a subscriber, please become one. God bless. Take care. We'll see you guys in just a few minutes on Ronaldo's program. Cheers, everybody. And my thanks to Frans Cronje.